Hey guys, so today I'm going to react to Oversimplified's World War I Part 1, and Part Two's reaction will be coming out in a few days. I'm just trying to start some Oversimplified reactions, but a few weeks ago I actually went to the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, where I did some research on an academic paper, so hopefully I can add some history to his awesome video. Here we go.
The world of 1914, a time of modern technology, culture, and fashion. Truly the height of civilization. Let's have a war. Everyone knew a big war was coming. France wanted some stuff back that Germany had taken from it.
So sorry to stop so early, I just want to give some context behind this region. So the Alsace-Lorraine is a region which was seized by the Germans during the Franco-Prussian War, and has always been sort of a region where it was contested by both the Germans and the French. So this area was actually given back to the French as a result of the Treaty of Versailles after the war, but this was one of the justifications for France going to war and maintaining their military alliances.
Germany wanted to take more of everyone's stuff, and they were building a big sexy navy that was making the British uncomfortable. These two empires thought they were really cool, but lots of different people.
So let's talk about the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is sort of an aging empire prior to World War I. They were involved in the Balkan Wars, which led to a few different countries which were previously part of their empire declaring independence. I think he actually, if I remember the video correctly, shows some years of when these countries gained independence. But because the Ottoman Empire was so inefficient during the war, they actually started to blame the ethnic Armenians for the problems that they had. So I'm sure he'll bring up the ethnic Armenians and the Armenian genocide, and I'll bring that up later. But key thing to know right now, they've lost a lot of different territories and parts of their empire, and they're frankly just losing it all, and it's what is modern-day Turkey.
Who lived there didn't think it was so cool, and some of them had even been declaring independence with help from...
See, there you go. There's the countries that gained independence from the Ottoman Empire.
Everyone was talking about each other behind each other's backs, throwing the fact that military technology had come a long way since the last major war, and suddenly everyone was pretty eager to beat each other up. In this area of Austria-Hungary lived some Serbs and Bosnians who hated living in Austria-Hungary. So the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand goes there for a nice drive in an open-top car with his...
Franz Ferdinand's actually a very interesting story for how he became the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We need to understand that Franz Ferdinand was the nephew of Austro-Hungarian's Emperor Franz Joseph. He was actually third in line to the throne, so he frankly probably should have never been the heir at all. So the original heir was actually Franz Joseph's son, Prince Rudolf. But he tragically committed suicide, and a few years later, Franz Ferdinand's father also died of illness. So that left Franz Ferdinand as the presumptive heir because Emperor Joseph did not have any remaining children.
Published in advance, and that went just about as well as you'd expect. Some assassins were waiting for him along the way and threw bombs at his car, but they missed and blew up some officers behind him instead. So the Archduke goes into hiding, leaves Sarajevo.
Ferdinand was killed by a man named Garveo Princip. I've always suck at pronouncing his name. It's like very Eastern European-y. But he was a member of the Black Hand terrorist group, and which was sort of kind of propped up by the Serbian government. There's still a lot of dispute over that historically. But what's unfortunate for the Black Hand is that Franz Ferdinand probably would have been a pretty fair emperor to the Serbians. So killing him obviously started World War I, but if they were just to wait for Ferdinand to come into power, groups such as the Black Hand could have gotten the freedom they wanted, but simultaneously the world wouldn't have been encompassed in World War I. Some historians believe that Ferdinand was the sole reason for World War I. I tend to think that war was inevitable just because of other historical factors, which I'll get into later in the video, but Franz Ferdinand probably would have been pretty fair to the Serbians.
The Cold War never happened, except no, the Archduke doesn't leave, but instead goes back out in the open-top car to visit the injured officers in hospital. The driver takes a wrong turn and by sheer coincidence gets stuck beside one of the veiled assassins, who shoots him. Austria-Hungary is understandably pissed about all this, and they think the Serbian government had something to do with it, which they might have. So they go to their ally Germany and say, hey Germany, we're going to declare war on Serbia. And Germany is all for that. So Austria-Hungary send a big list of impossible demands to Serbia, and when Serbia refuses, they declare war. Austria-Hungary and Germany are friends, and Serbia is protected by Russia, who's friends with France.
Now we're going to get into what I believe is the largest reason why World War I happened, and frankly why it was inevitable, which is the elaborate military alliances within Europe. Obviously, you see that when Germany's allies in Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and Serbia is backed by Russia, who has an alliance with France, who has an alliance with England. You can see that there's just chain reaction going on, which could lead from one little country to have a huge domino effect, which could bring a whole continent into war. I'm not saying that this is going to happen in modern day times, but you see history kind of rhyming when you see NATO Article 5. If you look at Latvia, a very small country, I would consider Latvia pretty insignificant. There's other small NATO members as well. If Russia or China were to attack Latvia, this could trigger Article 5, which could bring what would be a small conflict of Latvia versus China or Latvia versus Russia, and it would bring in powers such as the United States, Britain, France, and it could become a all-encompassing world war. In fact, classical literature actually warns us about these military alliances. Within Homer's Iliad, I think actually technically before Homer's Iliad, the Trojan War escalated from a conflict between Prince Paris and King Menelaus because Odysseus had every Greek king swear an oath that they would protect the marriage of Menelaus and Helen of Troy. So it started off as a conflict over one man's wife, escalated to a 10 years long full-scale war. See, you see history rhyming from period to period, time period, region to region. This is all going on, and it's extremely fascinating that within ancient Greece and within our time today, we could see these small conflicts just start huge wars that kill thousands and millions of people. Just something to think about.
So they all declare war on each other. Montenegro joins in too. France and Britain also have a kind of alliance. So when France says, hey Britain, you got my back? Britain is like, maybe. And then they decide to stay out of it, which is great for Germany because Germany has a...
So I don't believe Oversimplified goes over it, but I wanted to discuss the leaders of Germany, Russia, and England during World War I. So I like to call World War I the greatest family feud in world history, just because the leaders of all three of those countries were actually cousins. Kaiser Wilhelm, King George, Tsar Nicholas, all were descendants of Queen Victoria. King George and Tsar Nicholas actually looked so much alike that people couldn't tell them apart when they were children. Just Google the two of them pictured together, and it is striking. But Tsar Nicholas actually attempted to write to his cousin, the Kaiser, to prevent war from happening, but because of these complex alliances, because of all the external factors going on, he was unable to persuade his cousin, and frankly, I don't know how much Kaiser Wilhelm could have done about it, but it's very interesting that these essentially three cousins just went to war with each other, which honestly probably could have been prevented.
Plan. They know that Russia is so big and clumsy that it will take them a while to get ready for war. So with this guy in charge,
So let's talk about the Schlieffen Plan. Germany understood that prior to the war, they could not fight on two fronts. Russia had the greatest military in the world. They obviously, prior to the war, or I guess it's obvious to me, that they lost a war to Japan, but they were also an extremely well-established military, and France was also a very well-established military. So Russia being the country it would take them, or at least it was assumed that it would take us extremely long to mobilize their army. And the goal of Germany was essentially to take out France early and then mobilize the troops in the east to combine forces with the Austro-Hungarians to knock out Russia. Simple enough, right? But what ends up happening is due to the weapons in the fortified French border, the Germans have to move through Belgium, a neutral country, which kind of pisses off the United Kingdom because now Germany's attacking a neutral country. They're not at war with Belgium. So that brings the United Kingdom into the war, even though they had the sort of kind of alliance with France. But the Belgians did a pretty good job of halting the Germans, which prevented them from completing the Schlieffen Plan. But even worse is that Russia mobilized a lot faster. So Germany would have to fight this two-front war, and the Austro-Hungarians also did an awful job of helping the Germans on the Eastern Front. So overall, the Schlieffen Plan, good in theory. If it wasn't for this pesky Belgians, maybe it works. I don't know.
Will send all its troops into France at lightning speed while Russia's getting ready. Defeat France, then move all the troops to Russia and defeat Russia, and then we all speak German and eat Pfeffer Potast every day. Just one problem. France has loads of forts and defenses along its German border, and Germany can't waste any time fighting them, so Germany decides to go around them through Belgium. Belgium is neutral, but Germany wants to march 750,000.
I'm sure he's going to get into it a little bit, but the Belgian campaign ended up being a publicity nightmare for the Germans. Today it's known as the Rape of Belgium. The Germans committed just numerous atrocities to Belgian civilians. Thousands were killed in bombings. There was forced labor, slave labor, kangaroo courts occurred. It was just an overall mess, and the Allies, they capitalized it. They used Belgium as a propaganda machine. But simultaneously, some of the most despicable acts of the war happened during the German invasion of Belgium, and this was all to enact the Schlieffen Plan.
Through it to get around France's defenses. They're hoping Belgium will just kind of sit down and shut up, but they don't. They fight back, and they're pretty good too, so they slow the Germans down. What's worse is that Britain shows up, and they're pretty pissed that Germany's invading neutral countries. So now Britain declares war on Germany. So Germany push on through Belgium and commit some atrocities along the way. They also wear spikes and sometimes skulls on the uniform. So if you're trying to not look like the bad guys, good job. The Allies have a propaganda extravaganza, and this starts having an influence.
There you go. You see the propaganda now. You see the propaganda that the Allies are using to rile up troops, to get recruiting up, to get war bonds, to get all of that going. But this is all because of the Rape of Belgium.
Around the world, notably in America. The U.S. President Woodrow Wilson sees himself as a bit of a Jesus figure and spends most of the war trying to get everyone to just hug it.
Woodrow Wilson is one of the worst presidents in United States history. I could do a whole video on him, but just to put into context here about how bad he was, he played the birth of the nation in the White House, which is a Reconstruction South movie depicting the Ku Klux Klan as the good guys. That should explain everything you need to know about him.
But there's also a large population of ethnic Germans living in the United States, and when the war first broke out, they were like, yay, Germany. But now that they're committing atrocities in Belgium, they're less enthusiastic. Let's play Spot the...
Yeah, you can kind of see the historical trends. Germans were, frankly, pretty discriminated against during this time. Not to the level the Japanese were during World War II, but they were. This is where you started to hear the term kraut. This is where some people actually stopped drinking German beer because of it. And that's just a very interesting thing that, again, you're seeing these historical trends of people being discriminated against during times of war.
Soldier. Did you see him? Easy, right? He's wearing a bright blue uniform with red trousers. And do you know who else spotted him easily too? The Germans. So when the French were slowly marching in columns through the countryside, the Germans easily tore them to shreds with their giant guns.
Prior to the war, the tactics for war were extremely outdated. You would have cavalry charges, no helmets for uniforms, the ridiculous outfits you just saw with the red pants and the blue uniforms. 19th century military tactics were really what was being used at the time, but with modern weapons, which is why early in the war you would have battles with just insane casualty numbers. Eventually, when trench warfare took place, there would be rage which would cost thousands of lives for inches of territory gain. This is why, in my opinion, World War I is the worst war to fight in world history. But here you are. I didn't even realize I paused on this, but there are the four things here that everyone thought were great prior to the war, but ended up being just huge, huge liabilities if you still enacted these tactics.
Nations involved in this war went in with an old school war mentality, and all of them had to update their uniforms and tactics a lot during the Great War. Because this...
Look at that, no boots. Imagine fighting a war with no boots. That is insane. I can't even imagine, like, what would you fight in? Would you fight in just leather shoes? It's crazy. Crazy tactics prior to this war.
was going to be like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Russia's ready for war, and way earlier than expected. Hey, Austria-Hungary, can you get on top of that?
No, they can't.
Oh yeah, sure, we've got this. Nope. So Germany has to send some troops back to the...
So the Austrian-Hungarians were obviously extremely inefficient army during the war. And frankly, this would be one of Germany's huge hindrances during the war. The Germans would constantly have to bail out their allies in Austria and the Ottoman Empire. But just imagine if these countries ran competent campaigns and the Germans wouldn't have to bail them out all the time. I think Germany might have a legitimate chance of winning the war if they just had efficient allies, but that's alternative history, so I can speculate all I want. Who knows?
To defend against the Russians. The chief of staff of the Austro-Hungarian army is this guy, and although he is handsome, he turns out not to be the best military strategist. Austria-Hungary constantly ignores Germany's advice, and then comes running back to Germany whenever they get in trouble. Austria-Hungary even gets its ass kicked by tiny Serbia, who repels all their invasion attempts at the start of the war.
They had no boots and they kicked their ass. Let's point that out. Go Serbia.
Better news for Germany in the north, though, where they almost completely wipe out the Russian Second Army. Back on the Western Front, the Germans continue advancing and are in sight of Paris. At this point, anyone would be forgiven for thinking the Germans were going to get that quick victory after all. But then things start to go wrong. The French commander-in-chief knew something had to be done, and he ordered his armies to stop retreating. In the resulting battle, a gap opened up in the German lines. If a gap opens up, the enemy can use it to flank you from the side and behind, so the German armies have to retreat. The Allies launch a counterattack, so the Germans dig into defensive positions.
So, you have the beginning of trench warfare, what in my opinion is the worst way to fight a war. Within these trenches, soldiers would experience trench foot, which would create gangrene, cholera, typhus, all the terrible diseases. Later in the war, the Spanish flu outbreak would go into the trenches. It was absolutely disgusting. And an interesting thing is that the common conception of trench warfare is that soldiers spent 24/7 in these trenches, which is actually not true. They would take 6-day shifts, 6 days in the trenches, 6 days behind the front lines. But during major offenses, soldiers could stay within the trenches for weeks to months, which is just disgusting. It's amazing that these men put through this. I couldn't even imagine it, but World War I, worst war to fight in as a soldier, in my opinion. I guess you can debate that in the comment section.
Do the same. Then both sides move north, trying to outflank each other along the way. When they reach the sea, they're in a stalemate with trench systems running the whole way from the coast to Switzerland, the beginning of trench warfare on the Western Front. Here's how trench warfare works. Two opposing lines of trenches with no man's land in between. One side would pummel the other with hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, sometimes for days at a time. This had a huge psychological effect on the soldiers, leaving many shell-shocked. Then, the attacking troops would leave their trenches and rush across no man's land, a muddy wet mass of shell craters and barbed wire. The defending trench would unleash machine gun fire on the attackers, inflicting thousands of casualties. The attackers would send wave after wave until either they gave up or the opposing trench was finally overrun. There would be months of fighting and the deaths of thousands in order to gain a few meters or kilometers of land.
Look at that. It barely moved. As I said before, there were some campaigns where you'd get a few inches of land and thousands would die. It was crazy. I guess I should talk about some of the tactics of trench warfare. Simplistically said, trench warfare was a very defensive strategy to warfare. However, prior to the war, there was a consensus of going on the offensive was actually advantageous than falling back. So it was the cult of the offensive, if you will. Early in the war, you would see cavalry charges or soldiers just charging with bayonets and just the old glory things that you see in old war movies. And they would just be unleashing just machine gun after machine gun fire on these people. But commanders would just refuse to fall back. And instead, they believed counterattacking was the most advantageous thing to do. As the war went on, these tactics gradually adapted, but it just should go with saying that at the start of the war, casualty rates were insane just because you had this contrast between old warfare and new warfare.
Living in the trenches was hard work too. Corpses, mud that could swallow you whole, pools of poisonous water, rats, disease, the smell. It's insane that millions of soldiers put up with these conditions, and commanders ordered them to do so for years. So
you're seeing the hint of this. There was goal of World War One, frankly, changed as the war went on because of trench warfare. They realized that it wasn't going to be an absolute victory, and instead you would just have to demoralize the public as much as they can. And it actually worked in some cases. Russia, obviously, they had a revolution. It toppled the czar. I'm sure you'll get to that later on. Germany was having mass uprisings within the country, and there was just all this speculation of whether the Kaiser could survive the war, but it just became a war that just got dragged out because they knew that they could not win it the conventional way. And that's it, everyone. Thank you for watching, and I will get part two to you very soon. And as always, just like and subscribe if you want more oversimplified content.